CD7.
A knot had formed in Elliot's stomach, and he remained motionless in his chair for several minutes, devastated by the dirty trick fate had played on him. Then he consulted the next day's paper, knowing in advance what he would find there. No miracle for Golden Gate suicide. There was no miracle at Lenox Hospital. Elena Cruz, the young woman who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge the day before yesterday, died during the night as a result of severe internal lesions. See yesterday's edition. This new death has revived the debate about the need to install a safety barrier on the bridge, a measure that has consistently been rejected by the Golden Gate Council. He left the building, feeling utterly destroyed. His car had been double-parked for an hour without getting a ticket. Cold comfort. He got behind the wheel and headed for Lenox Hospital. He had one last thing to verify. San Francisco, December 25, 1976, 8:23 p.m. Elliot is 30. Overwhelmed with anxiety, Elliot was waiting for Elena to come out of the operating room. Since he wasn't on duty, they hadn't wanted him to operate, and since the effects of the heroin were lingering, he hadn't insisted. The diagnosis was catastrophic. Fractures in both legs and both feet, dislocated hip and shoulder, trauma to the thoracic cavity. The shock had been so violent that it had also shattered her pelvis, caused damage to the kidneys and spleen, and vaginal bleeding indicated a ruptured intestine or urinary tract. He couldn't keep still, pacing up and down before returning to the glass doors separating him from the operating room. He had already seen enough to keep from comforting himself with illusions. He himself often operated in cases of multiple trauma, and you had to be realistic. At this stage, the likelihood of death was greater than that of survival. Not to mention the fact that an accident like this often caused injuries to the spinal column and the spinal cord, the kind of injuries that frequently leave a patient paraplegic or hemiplegic. For an instant, the image of a paralyzed Elena pulling herself around in a wheelchair went through his mind, superimposed on a memory of the young woman who only yesterday was swimming and diving with the dolphins. This was all his fault. He and his double had thought they were saving Elena, but they only succeeded in delaying the outcome for a few hours. Instead of being drowned by a whale, she had committed suicide by jumping off a bridge. What a triumph! They had tried to defy fate, but fate was stronger. San Francisco, December 25th, 2006, 10:59 p.m. Elliot is 60. Torrential rain was falling on Lenox Hospital. In the third sub-basement of the building, in the light from a sputtering neon bulb, Elliot was searching through 30-year-old records, looking for Elena's medical file. The room was lined with metal shelves sagging under the weight of boxes. In the distant past, all of these documents must have been classified in a precise order, but now the whole room was nothing but a colossal shambles. Months, years, departments, everything was mixed up, confused, scattered. As he frantically opened every box and every file, Elliot tried to make sense of what he'd gone through in the last 3 months. At first, he had naively believed that he could change fate, and fate had reminded him of its power. He had to accept the evidence. Free will, the ability to influence your own destiny, that was all an illusion. The truth is that our lives are pre-programmed, and it's futile to fight against it. Some events are irrefutable, and the hour of our death is one of them. The future is not created step by step. In essence, the road is already laid out, and there is nothing to be done but to follow it. Everything hangs together, past to the dread name of destiny. But if everything is already written, who is holding the pen? A superior power? A god? And leading us where? Knowing very well that he would never have an answer to that question, Elliot concentrated on his search, and after a full hour he finally laid his hands on what he was looking for. Elena's admission file had not disappeared, but the ravages of time had made the contents practically illegible. The handwritten notes were faded, and dampness had stuck some pages together. Elliot feverishly brought the sheets of paper close to the neon tube and managed to decipher the essential information in the document. Elena's injuries were even more horrible than he'd imagined. But contrary to what he'd read in the paper, she hadn't died from multiple lesions, but from the effects of an emergency operation to remove a cerebral hematoma. He looked at the name of the doctor who had operated on her. Dr. Mitchell. He remembered him. Roger Mitchell was a competent surgeon, but why didn't I operate myself? He was also surprised by the absence of an MRI report. Looking through the notes, he managed to reconstruct what must have happened. Around 4 a.m, a nurse had reported irregularity in Elena's pupils, indicating the presence of a hematoma. There had been an emergency operation, but it had not succeeded. The hematoma was deep and located in a difficult position, complicated by a wound in the sinus canal that could not have been predicted without an MRI. A very delicate operation on a patient with respiratory distress and low blood pressure. Even the best surgeon wouldn't have saved her, except perhaps by anticipating what needed to be done. A final bit of information drew his attention. The time of death. 4:26 a.m. He couldn't help looking at his watch. It was not yet midnight. San Francisco, December 26, 1976, 12:23 a.m. Elliot is 30. I've removed the spleen and restitched part of the intestine, Dr. Roger Mitchell explained to his young colleague. For the first time, Elliot, filled with anguish, found himself on the other side, with the patients and their families. "How are the kidneys?" he asked. "They may be all right, but I'm worried about the respiratory system. Several connected ribs are fractured in at least 2 places." Elliot knew what that meant. One segment of the thoracic cavity was detached from the thorax, increasing the risks of pneumothorax, hemothorax, and respiratory distress. Lesions of the spinal column? Too soon to tell. Maybe at the dorsal vertebra. As you know, at that level, it's all or nothing. It may be benign, and it may lead to permanent paraplegia, concluded Elliot. Mitchell pursed his lips. "We have to wait. For now, we can't do much." "You're not giving her an MRI?" "Not tonight. There's a problem with the software. The program has been constantly crashing ever since this morning." "God damn it to hell!" Elliot yelled, banging his fist against the door. "Calm down. We have her under close supervision. A nurse will look in every 15 minutes. And in any case..." He was about to say something, but thought better of it. "In any case?" asked Elliot, forcing him to finish his sentence. "The only thing we can do at this stage is to pray. Pray we don't have to open her up too soon, because in the condition she's in, she won't hold up." San Francisco, December 26, 2006, 1:33 a.m. Elliot is 60. Elliot went upstairs, clutching Elena's old medical file to his chest. Even if he'd stopped operating 2 months ago, he was still on the hospital staff and had the right to keep his office. The lights came on automatically as soon as he opened the door. He stood motionless, rain still falling on the city. Then he paced up and down the room, his mind tormented. wondering if he could still do something. He went through Elena's medical file again and put it on his work table next to a stylized marble chess set with a very spare design. Pensively, he picked up two pieces, a bishop in a conical shape and a cylindrical rook. Cone and cylinder. That reminded him of a fable he'd read in school. He laid the cone on its side on the table and flicked it with his finger. The solid form rotated around itself. He did the same thing to the cylinder. It rolled over the table and broke on the floor. The two pieces had received the same force, but had followed different trajectories. The moral of the story? People react differently to the same blow of fate. Even if I can't escape my destiny, I'm still master of the way I face it. Encouraged by this idea, Elliot put his hand in his pocket and grasped the bottle of pills. He had lived through a trying day, and it was far from over. But now he felt surprisingly calm, because a man is never as strong as when he is fighting his last battle. Chapter 19. 7th and 8th Encounters. If youth knew, if old age could. San Francisco, December 26, 1976, 2:01 a.m. Elliot is 30. The hospital was dozing, lulled by the sound of the rain. Elena was lying with her eyes closed in a small, darkened room. She was surrounded by a tangle of drips, and she had a breathing tube in her mouth. Elliot was sitting next to her. He cautiously pulled the sheet higher as though he was afraid she would get cold. Overcome, he moved his trembling hand toward the young woman's face. As their skin touched, he felt razor blades slashing through his heart. Beneath the bruised features and the blue lips, he felt a life struggling to keep its flame alive. A life hanging by a single thread that was ready to break at any moment. The door to the room opened quietly. Elliot turned around, expecting to see the floor nurse. But it wasn't her. "She has to be operated on," said his double in a tone that would not allow contradiction. Elliot jumped to his feet. "Operated on for what?" "A subdural hematoma in the brain." Panic-stricken, the young doctor lifted Elena's eyelids. But he saw no anomaly in the pupils, indicating a hematoma. "Where'd you get that from?" "From an autopsy report. If you'd done a scan, you would know it too." "Easy," Elliot defended himself. "It's only 1976. Machines break down. Software crashes half the time. Don't you remember?" His double didn't bother answering. All his attention was on deciphering the EKG. "Tell them to get an operating room ready, quickly," he said, pointing to the phone on the wall. "Wait. She's got several chest lesions. If we open her up right away, she might die." "Yes, and if we don't open her up, what's now a risk will become a certainty." Elliot considered this before making another objection. "Mitchell will never operate on Elena on a hunch." The old man shrugged his shoulders. "If you think I'm going to let Mitchell operate." "Who then?" "Me." Elliot agreed, including himself in the me. But there was a further problem. The two of us alone can't do the operation. We need at least an anesthetist and a nurse. "Who's the anesthetist on call?" "Samantha Ryan, I think." The old doctor nodded and looked at the clock on the wall. "I'll see you in the operating room in 10 minutes, he said, as he left the room. "Prepare Elena for the operation, and I'll take care of Ryan." The 60-year-old Elliot rushed into the almost empty lobby. To make which smelled inconspicuous, he replaced his jacket with a white coat. He knew the hospital like the back of his hand, and had no trouble finding the rec room where Samantha Ryan was resting. "Hi, Sam," he said, as he turned on the light. Being used to having her sleep interrupted when she was on call at night, the young woman quickly got up and covered her eyes with her hand to protect them from the glare. Although the face in front of her looked familiar, she couldn't seem to remember his name. Elliot handed her a cup of coffee, which she took as she brushed the hair out of her eyes. She was an unusual woman, 30, of Irish descent, gay, and a practicing Catholic. She had been working at the hospital for 2 years after severing ties with her family in New York, where her father and brothers were pillars of the NYPD. In the years to come, she and Elliot would become good friends. But at this point in time, Samantha was solitary, introverted, and ill at ease with herself. She seemed to have no friends in the hospital, and her colleagues kept their distance. "I need you for an operation, Sam." "Right away?" "Right away. A subdural hematoma to be drained in a patient suffering from respiratory distress." "The suicide victim?" she said, and took a gulp of coffee. "Exactly." "She's not going to make it," she said calmly. "Only the future can tell," Elliot replied. She unwrapped a few Oreo cookies from some tinfoil. "Who's operating?" she asked, and dipped a cookie in her coffee. "I am." "And who are you, by the way?" "Someone who knows you." She exchanged glances with the doctor, and for a minute felt unsettled. She had the fleeting impression that this man could read her like a book. "We have to move quickly," said Elliot. Samantha shook her head. "Mitchell's the chief resident. I can't work on an unauthorized operation. I'll get fired." "There are risks," Elliot agreed. "But you will help me." "I don't owe you anything," she said with a shrug. "Not me. But you owe Sarah Leaves something." He let the sentence hang, and she looked at him in panic. Sarah Leaves was a 2-bit hooker who'd come into the hospital 2 years earlier, having been beaten and stabbed. She'd been given emergency treatment, but she hadn't survived. "You were starting out here, and you were on call," said Elliot. "You're a good anesthetist, Sam, one of the best. But that night you really screwed up." Samantha closed her eyes, and for the 1000th time relived the events in her mind. A wrong move, one drug confused with another, an elementary mistake, and the poor woman never woke up. "You were clever enough to cover your tracks," said Elliot, "and I have to admit that nobody was especially interested in the death of a hooker." Samantha's eyes were still closed. She'd made the mistake because she hadn't been on her toes. That night, her mind kept wandering. Back to New York and her father who called her slut, tramp, little whore. And her mother repeated the word shame over and over. And her brothers telling her to leave town. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Elliot in terror. "How do you know all that?" "Because you told me about it." Samantha shook her head. She'd never told anyone about the incident, not even in confession. On the other hand, she'd grown more deeply religious in the last 2 years, and prayed constantly as if to expiate her sin. More than anything, she wished she could turn the clock back, make it so that horrible day had never happened. She had constantly prayed that heaven would send her the possibility of redemption. "Save a life to make up for a death," said Elliot, figuring out what she was thinking. After a few seconds' hesitation, Samantha buttoned her coat and said simply, "I'm on my way." Elliot was about to come after her when he felt his hands start to tremble. Already? He took refuge in the bathroom, which was fortunately deserted at that time of night. He was panic-stricken as he felt himself to throw water on his face. Unlike Samantha, he didn't believe in God. But this didn't stop him from praying, "Let me operate on her. Let me stay a little longer." But the God in whom he didn't believe didn't give a damn about his pleas. And Elliot had no choice but to let himself be sucked into the labyrinth of time. He woke up in 2006, drained, on his office chair. In panic, he looked at the digital clock on the shelf. 2:23. He still had a little time, provided he returned immediately to the past. He hurriedly swallowed another pill, but nothing happened. This was to be expected. The substance only worked when he was asleep, but he was too anxious to fall asleep on command. So he hurried into the corridor and called for the elevator to go down to the hospital pharmacy. He dug up a vial of narcotic used to prepare patients for anesthesia, rushed back up to his office to get a disposable syringe out of his bag. He prepared a small dose of the medicine and injected it into a vein. The hypnotic didn't take long to kick in, and Elliot was soon in the land of dreams and fantasies. At the same moment, in 1976, 30-year-old Elliot was finishing the preparations for Elena's operation. He'd shaved her head and had just disconnected the breathing tube. He set up an inflatable balloon so she could breathe on the way there, and wheeled her to the operating room as discreetly as possible. Samantha Ryan and a nurse were waiting for him. There was, on the other hand, no sign of his double. Then he heard someone rapping on the window. The old doctor signaled that he should come in to scrub up, and Elliot complied without a word. Finally together, the two surgeons rolled up their sleeves above their elbows and prepared in silence, methodically scrubbing their hands with antiseptic, then each putting on a gown, mask, rubber gloves, and a surgical cap. Then they both entered the operating room. Elliot stands back, letting his double manage the affair. The older man is at ease, very calm, coordinating every gesture involved in placing Elena on the operating table. He keeps her head steady, avoiding any flexion or rotation. He knows that she has vertebral lesions and does not want to aggravate them by any sudden movement. Finally, the operation begins. The older doctor has a strange feeling. He hasn't operated for 2 months, and he thought he'd never hold a scalpel again. His actions are precise. Over time, he has learned to handle the pressure of these critical moments. He knows exactly where he has to cut. His hands don't shake. Everything is going well until, "Who gave you permission to operate?" Mitchell has just come into the room, and he is livid with anger. He looks one after the other at Samantha, Elliot, and his double. "Who is he?" he asks, indicating the old surgeon, who calmly points out, "You're not sterile, Dr. Mitchell, and you just failed to diagnose a hematoma." Angered, Mitchell puts a mask to his face and promises, "You won't get away with this." "Please disinfect yourself," Elliot repeats, forcing the furious doctor to leave. The operation continues surprisingly calmly. Outside, the storm is raging, and rain can be heard lashing at the windows and flowing through the drains. Elliot at 30 looks at his senior with a mixture of admiration and mistrust. Elliot at 60 remains focused on his task. Even though everything is going well, it is obvious that the depth of the hematoma, its size, and Elena's respiratory problems make the prognosis very uncertain. He knows that even in the best case, her comatose state will cause lack of blood to the brain with severe after-effects. What are the chances of her coming through this? Medically, 1 in 20 that she'll survive, and maybe 1 in 1,000 that she won't suffer serious consequences. But in the course of his career, he's learned to consider these figures with skepticism. He's known patients to whom doctors have given 3 months who've lived for routine operations end in tragedy. This is what he's thinking when a stream of blood splashes his face. This is what he's been fearing, a wound in the sinus compressed by the hematoma, It's bleeding profusely, but he's warned the others, and the blood is carefully drained. He makes an effort to freeze his feelings, focusing entirely on the area of the operation, not even thinking that it's Elena he's operating on. Because if he starts to visualize her face, he knows that his hand will start shaking and his vision might become blurred. The operation continues calmly until Mitchell re-enters the room with a duty manager. They take note of the infraction of the rules, but do not attempt to interrupt the operation, which is, in any event, coming to an end. As he anticipates the start of his trembling, Elliot at 60 turns to his younger self and suggests, "I'll let you close up." He takes off his gown and his cap, removes his blood-stained gloves, and looks at his hands. They have withstood the shock without shaking for longer than he'd hoped. "Thank you," he whispers, not really knowing to whom he's offering his gratitude. This was his last operation, the most important one of his entire life. At the very moment that he disappears before the stunned gaze of the others, he tells himself that he has done enough. Now he is no longer afraid to die. Chapter 20. Last Encounter. At 20, you dance in the center of the world. At 30, you wander inside the circle. At 50, you walk on the circumference, and you avoid looking both outside and inside. Later on, it makes no difference. It's the privilege of children and the old to be invisible. Christian Bobbin. San Francisco, 2006. Elliot is 60. When Elliot opened his eyes, he was lying on the cold tile of his office floor, his face in a little puddle of blood. He struggled to his feet and brought his hand to his nose, which was flowing like a fountain. His blood vessels had once more paid the price of his journey in time, and it took several cotton swabs to stop the bleeding. As day broke, one question still tormented him. Had he managed to save Elena? He sat in front of his computer to consult the online phone directory. The day before, he had gotten no results when looking for Elena Cruz. Elliot tried again, extending his search throughout the state of California. This time it came up with something. An address in Weaverville, a little town in the northern part of the state. A wild goose chase? Too soon to rejoice? There was only one way to find out. He left his office, went down to the lobby, made a brief stop at the coffee machine, and went out into the parking lot to find his car. If he drove fast, he could get to Weaverville in less than 6 hours. Like him, his old VW was worn out, but he hoped it would come through, just for a little while longer. It was still early morning when he got on the road. The sun had not yet risen, but the previous day's heavy rain seemed to have painted the sky a metallic blue. He left San Francisco on Route 101 and quickly covered the first 200 miles. A little past Leggett, he left the highway to follow the scenic route that wound its way as far as Ferndale, following the coast around Cape Mendocino. The road clung to the edge of the land, the sea, overlooking steep cliffs that plunged into the swells of the Pacific. Elliot followed it to Arcata, then picked up Route 299, the only passable road over the mountains. The area looked as wild as ever, with huge sequoia trunks and vast forest preserves of silver firs. He had been driving for more than 5 hours when he got to Weaverville, a tiny town lost in the mountains. He parked the VW on the main street and went into the town drugstore to ask for the address of Elena Cruz. He was directed to a forest road on the way out of town, and decided to go he came to a little wooden house built on a spot just down from the road. The sound of a waterfall could be heard nearby. Elliot stopped in his tracks and hid behind a sequoia that had survived the clear-cutting 100 years earlier. Using both hands to protect his eyes from the glare, he squinted and stared. A woman was sitting under the cottage's awning, facing the snow-capped mountains. That afternoon, Elliot saw her only from behind, but he didn't doubt for a second that it was her. They had been separated for 30 years. Now there were only 30 yards between them. For an instant, he made himself believe that he would cross that space, that he would tell her everything, that he would hold her in his arms, and would once again be able to smell the aroma of her hair. But it was too late. His last journey in time had considerably weakened him. Now more than ever he knew that his life was behind him, and that he had lost his battle against the disease sapping his strength. So he sat against the trunk of the 1,000-year-old tree and was content just to look at her. The air was warm, and in this solitary and peaceful place he finally felt free of the weight of time and sorrow. For the first time in his life, he was at peace. San Francisco, 1976, 9 a.m. Elliot is 30. 2 days had passed since Elena's operation. The young woman had come out of her coma a short time ago, but her prognosis was still very uncertain. The circumstances surrounding the operation were the talk of the hospital. People were either skeptical or incredulous. For a few hours, hospital management had debated what course of conduct to follow. Should they report the incident to the police and risk compromising the prestige of Lenox Hospital? The hospital director and the chief of surgery were too attached to their reputations to sign a report about a man from nowhere who disappeared in the middle of the operating room. They merely imposed a penalty of 2 months' suspension for Elliot and Samantha. The young doctor had just learned of his suspension and was about to leave the hospital when a nurse called to him. "It's for you, doctor." She held out the wall phone receiver. "Hello? I'm across the street," his double informed him. "Come and join me." "Across the street? At Harry's place." "Should I order something for you?" Not bothering to answer, Elliot hung up and crossed the road. You could hardly see your hand in front of your face. Patches of fog were blowing in the wind, enveloping lampposts and cars in their shifting shapes. Harry's Diner was a real old-fashioned steel dining car across the street from the emergency room entrance. Entering it was like going back into the 50s. Elliot went in and saw a number of his medical colleagues having a quick breakfast before going on duty. At one end of the smoke-filled room, he saw his double sitting at a table with a mug of coffee. "Well?" asked Elliot, sitting down in the booth. "She made it." "Elena is alive? In the future?" The old doctor nodded. Elliot couldn't believe it for a moment. Then he asked, "After effects?" But his double evaded the question. "Listen, she's alive. We saved her." Elliot decided to hang on to this assertion, and for a few minutes the two men sat facing each other in silence, united in contemplation. Both had drawn features and circles under their eyes. Both were exhausted from lack of sleep and the accumulated nervous tension of the last few days. They had thrown all their strength into a strange battle against fate, and they'd apparently emerged victorious. Elliot was the first to break. Tears of exhaustion streamed down his face, and he didn't know himself whether they were making him feel better or worse. He rubbed his eyes and looked out the window. Outside, the fog was spreading its white-gray waves, obliterating the sidewalks and the fire hydrants. "It'll be all right." "No, I've lost everybody I loved. Right. Matt, Elena, and all because of you." "Maybe. But that's the way it is. You have to keep your promises, the way I've kept mine." "Easy for you to say." "We've already talked about that." Listen, I don't know by what miracle we were able to save Elena, so don't go spoiling everything. Lead your life the way you promised to, because if there's one thing I'm sure of, it's that miracles never happen twice. It will be too hard to bear. The next few years will be difficult, the old doctor admitted. Afterward, everything will be better. You are able to bear it, but you'll have to do it alone. Elliot looked at him and frowned. His double explained, "This is the last time we'll see each other." Elliot shrugged. "You say that every time." "This time it's true. I won't be able to come back, even if I want to." In a few words, he told the story of the pills, the circumstances in which he'd received them, the unexpected effect they'd had on him, the way they'd allowed him to travel through time. Before he had finished his story, his double had stood up to leave the restaurant. Elliot was dying to ask him hundreds of questions, but he understood that he would learn nothing further, that this was indeed the last time they would meet. While the old man gathered himself together, the young surgeon felt overcome by an emotion he had not foreseen. 2 nights earlier, during the operation on Elena, his older self had astonished him with his skill and his ability to make the right decisions. Elliot now regretted not having had more time to get to know him. The old doctor took the time to button his coat. He felt himself leaving, but from experience, he knew that he still had 1 or 2 minutes. "I'd just as soon not disappear in the middle of the diner." "You're right, it might make trouble for me." At the moment of his departure, the 60-year-old Elliot simply put his hand on the 30-year-old Elliot's shoulder before walking away. He'd almost reached the door when he turned around one last time to nod to his double. They looked at each other, and in the eyes of his younger self, he saw what he had already seen in some of his patients: the sorrow of those who had never gotten over the pain of their childhood. Instead of leaving the restaurant, he retraced his steps. He still had one more thing to say to his double, a sentence that he himself had waited to hear for years, but that no one had ever taken the trouble to say to him. A very simple sentence, but one that he'd taken a lifetime to understand. "It wasn't your fault." At first, the young surgeon didn't understand what his double was talking about. The old man repeated, "It wasn't your fault." "What?" "Mom's suicide. The beatings Dad gave you." The Elliot of 60 left his sentence hanging when he realized that his voice was choked up. He needed to take a deep breath before he could repeat, like a litany, "It wasn't your fault." "I know," Elliot lied, troubled by this unexpected conversation. "No, you don't know yet," his older self calmly asserted. "You don't know yet." A kind of communion followed between the two men. A moment of understanding that lasted just the blink of an eye. And then the old man was shaken by the trembling that announced his return to the future. "Goodbye," he said, as he walked quickly away. "It's up to you now." Elliot had sat down again. Through the window, he watched his double disappear into the fog. He would never see him again. Chapter 21. Living Without You. Life will have gone by like a great sad castle buggered by the winds. 1977. Elliot is 31. A summer night in San Francisco. Staring into space, Elliot is smoking a cigarette on the hospital roof. The city is spread out at his feet. But he pays no attention to it. He hasn't seen Elena since she was transferred to Miami, and it's killing him. A gust of wind stirs up a little dust. The young surgeon looks at his watch and stubs out his cigarette. He has an operation in 5 minutes, the 6th of the day. Living like a ghost, getting drunk on work, taking on any number of shifts, to keep from letting himself die. Elena opens her eyes as the sun is rising over Miami. She's been lying in a hospital bed for 6 months, her body devastated, her legs shattered. She's already gone through 4 operations, and it's not over yet. Mentally, it's even worse. There's nothing but chaos, screaming animals, and slamming doors. She speaks little. She has refused all visitors, Matt, her colleagues from work. She feels vulnerable, helpless. How can she pull herself out of this sorrow and shame? Matt is on the highway to Seattle, driving fast with the roof down. His brutal split with Elliot has ripped his life apart. He too has lost his bearings and everything he believed in. He feels lonely and miserable. So he thinks of Tiffany, the amazing girl he was stupid enough to let slip through his fingers. Now he's ready to try anything to find her. Every weekend for months, he's been scouring different parts of the country. All he has to go on is a first name and a telephone number that's long been out of service. Why her? He doesn't even ask himself the question. On the other hand, he's certain of one thing. He has to find this woman, because he senses that she could be the fixed point in his life, the one to come home to. 1978. Elena is 32. January. A rehab center in Florida. Chopin's nocturnes are playing in the background. For the first time this century, snow is falling on Miami. A young woman in a wheelchair looks through the window at the delicate white flakes swirling in the air. If only I'd been able to die, Elena thinks regretfully. Late August, a God-forsaken town somewhere in Texas. The barmaid looks at her reflection in the mirror. 3 days earlier, she celebrated her 35th birthday. Some party. More like a funeral, thinks Tiffany as she straightens her uniform. She's been back home for a few weeks and spends her days serving beers to hicks who stare at her breasts. She's back to square one. Back to the life she'd left at 17 to take her chances in California. At the time, everyone thought she was as pretty as a picture. She could sing, dance, act. But it hadn't been enough to separate her from the herd. Not in San Francisco, and not in Hollywood. "Let me have another, sweetie," says a customer, waving his mug. Tiffany sighs. Her dreams of glory are definitely over. The heat is stifling. The windows are wide open, and suddenly there's a squeal of tires in front of the bar. Then a few seconds later, a new customer comes in. At first, she can't believe her eyes. But she's forced to recognize that it's really him. She hasn't forgotten him, and has often regretted having left before things even started between them. He glances around the room, and his eyes light up. Then she understands that he's come for her, and that life sometimes gives us gifts when we least expect them. Matt approaches, almost timidly. "I've looked for you everywhere." And Tiffany answers, "Take me with you." 1979. Elliot is 33. It's fall. While Elliot is spending a few days' vacation in Sicily, a series of earthquakes hit southern Italy. Almost without thinking, he volunteers to help and is sent to join a Red Cross team in Santa Siena, a little village built on a mountainside. This episode marks the beginning of a long collaboration with the well-known NGO. But he doesn't know that yet. In the old village, the earthquake has destroyed everything in its wake. Houses, cars. In torrential rain, the rescue workers are struggling to dig through the ruins. They find 20 or so bodies, but also a few survivors trapped beneath the wreckage. Night has almost fallen when they hear the groans of a 6-year-old boy trapped at the bottom of a well. They lower a torch at the end of a rope. The hole is deep, and the well, which has half collapsed, is in danger of caving in completely. The kid is in mud up to his chest, and the level of water is rising constantly. They try to pull him up with the rope, but the kid is unable to hang on. At the risk of looking like a hothead, Elliot ties a rope around himself and goes down into the well. He doesn't deserve any admiration. He knows that today is not the day he will die. He's learned enough about his future to know that he'll live to be at least 60. For 27 more years, he will be immortal. 1980. Elena is 34. Winter. A deserted, windswept beach. Supported by a cane, Elena walks a few yards and then lets herself fall onto the wet sand. The doctors tell her she's still young, that she has an iron will, and that she'll walk almost normally again someday. In the meantime, no matter how many painkillers she takes, nothing works. The pain is still everywhere. In her body, in her head, in her soul. December 8th, Lenox Hospital, in the room for medical personnel. Collapsed on a couch with his eyes closed, Elliot is resting between 2 operations. His colleagues' conversations are murmuring in his ears. For or against Reagan? Who shot J.R.? Anybody heard the latest Stevie Wonder? Someone turns on the television, and suddenly they hear, John Lennon has just been assassinated in New York outside the Dakota by a disturbed individual named Mark Chapman. Even though emergency medical services came immediately, the doctors at Roosevelt Hospital were unable to save the former Beatle. 1981. It's a sunny day in Napa Valley. Matt and Tiffany are walking hand in hand between the rows of vines. For 3 years they have lived in perfect unity, in complete harmony, experiencing the kind of happiness everyone dreams about. Are there many people on earth this happy? Can love last for an entire lifetime? 1982. 2 in the morning in the bedroom of a small apartment in Lower Haight. Elliot slips out of bed, trying not to wake the woman lying beside him, whom he met a few hours before in a downtown bar. He picks up his underwear, his jeans, and his shirt, and gets dressed in silence. As he's about to slip away, a voice calls to him, "You're leaving?" "Yes, but stay in bed. I'll lock the door behind me." "By the way, my name is Lisa," the woman grumbles and buries herself under the covers. "I know. Then why did you call me Elena?" 1983. Matt and Tiffany are in each other's arms, lying in bed after making love. A tear is running down her cheek. They've been trying to have a child for 5 years. She's just turned 40. 1984. Days, weeks, years go by. For Elena, life once more has meaning. She's walking again, stumbling, limping, dragging her foot, but at least she's walking to return to her old profession. But she's made her peace with that. Overflowing with energy, she is teaching courses in marine biology at Stanford and has become one of the leading members of Greenpeace, playing an active role in new campaigns against burying radioactive waste at sea and helping set up the first European offices in Paris and London. It's summer in San Francisco. A ray of sun illuminates the hospital lobby. Elliot gets a Coke from the machine, sits in one of the chairs, and looks around. The television is tuned to a new cable channel called MTV. On the screen is Like a Virgin, featuring a young singer writhing lasciviously on the floor, making a series of suggestive movements and leaving nothing of her lingerie to the imagination. This is the beginning of the Madonna phenomenon. The hospital is amazingly calm. Someone has left a Rubik's Cube on one of the tables. Elliot picks it up and in a few moves restores uniform colors to all 6 sides. Like everyone, he has his good days and his bad days. Today he feels pretty good. He doesn't really know why, but he feels serene. At other times it's harder. Solitude combines with weariness to drag him toward a precipice of sadness and depression. And then an ambulance brings in another patient. Quickly he's needed. They have to operate. And for a moment life makes sense again. That's the blessing of this job. 1985. Verona, early spring. Elliot has been in Italy for 2 days for a surgical conference. If he remembers correctly what his double told him, today is the day he will meet the mother of his daughter. Sitting on the terrace of a trattoria, he is watching the sun set on the Piazza Bra. Orange-tinted rays gild the top of the arena, the magnificent Roman amphitheater overlooking the square. "For you, sir," says the waiter, bowing and setting a dry martini with 2 olives before him. Elliot sips his drink, but he can't manage to calm down. Just what is he supposed to do? He knows that he has an appointment with fate, but he's afraid he'll pass it by. He goes over and over his double's words in his head. They're a good 10 years old, but he has never forgotten them. On April 6th, 1985, during a surgical conference in Verona, you'll meet a woman who will show interest in you. You'll respond to her advances, and you'll spend a weekend together, during which our daughter will be conceived. It all seems simple, except that today is April 6th, it's almost 7 in the evening, and he's still waiting for some curvaceous Italian woman to come and whisper sweet nothings in his ear. "Anyone sitting here?" He looks up, surprised to hear these words in English, spoken with a New York accent. Standing in front of him is a young woman in a light pink suit. Maybe she noticed the International Herald Tribune on his table. In any event, she seems delighted to have come across a fellow American. Elliot nods and invites her to sit down. Her name is Pamela. She works for a large hotel chain, and she's in Verona on business. Is she the one? He wonders, suddenly anxious. It must be her. Everything fits. After all, his double never specified that she'd be Italian. He scrutinizes her as she orders a glass of Valpolicella. She's an 80s-style beauty, tall, statuesque, bouffant blonde hair, shoulder pads. By the time the entrees are served, they've gone past introductions and are talking about the heroes of the new America: Reagan, Michael Jackson, Spielberg, Carl Lewis. Elliot is on automatic pilot. He is keeping up his end of the conversation, but his mind is somewhere else. Strange. I never imagined it would be like this. He can't bring himself to believe that this woman will be the mother of his daughter. It's hard to explain why. There doesn't seem to be anything vapid. Her remarks are predictable. She's a Republican. She thinks more about having than being. And she doesn't have that certain something in her gaze, that extra spark called charm. And yet here it is. If he hadn't met his double, he'd have no way of knowing this flirtation would end up creating a new life. Still, It's weird that I'll let myself be taken in by this woman's chatter. Sure, after a few hours of gabbing, there's the prospect of a night of sex. But even so, despite Pamela's obvious attractions, Elliot tells himself it won't necessarily be an unalloyed pleasure. The meal continues with the local specialties: pasta e fasolie, risotto alla maroni, tornadoes con taleggio. All of it washed down with several glasses of Bardolino. The lights in the square are now illuminating the Palazzo Barbieri, the town hall, and the wide sidewalk where, despite the late hour, a crowd of Veronese are strolling. He asks for the check, but when it seems to be taking a long time, he decides to get up and pay directly at the bar. While the owner is adding up the bill, Elliot takes out a Marlboro and puts it to his lips. As he's about to flick his lighter, a flame touches the end of his cigarette. "Not bad. Your presentation this morning, Doctor." He looks up at the speaker, a woman of about 30 sitting on a stool with a glass of white wine in front of her. "You were at the conference? Giulia Battistini." She introduces herself and holds out her hand. "I'm a surgeon in Milan, a cardiologist." She has green eyes and red hair that doesn't look at all Italian. Their eyes meet, and he notices in hers the little glimmer that he'd missed in Pamela's: charm. With relief, he understands that she's the one, not Pamela, who will be the mother of his daughter. "I would have liked to talk more with you," Giulia begins, but what? She glances at the terrace. "I think your friend is waiting for you." I think she's not my friend. She smiles slightly, the modest triumph of someone who had been ready to fight harder. "In that case..." 1986. Elliot is 40. San Francisco, 5 in the morning. A call from Europe, ignoring the time difference. A woman with an Italian accent telling him what he already knows. Elliot takes a plane to Milan, jumps into a taxi to the hospital, goes up 4 floors on foot, and knocks at the door of room 466. "Hello, Giulia. Hello, Giulia's new partner. Hello, doctor. Hello, nurse." Finally, he approaches the cradle. He sees babies every day in the hospital, but this time it's different. This one is his. At first, he's afraid he'll feel nothing. Then she opens her eyes, looks at him, blinks, and he's hers for life. It's February outside. Snow, cold, traffic, car horns, angry drivers, pollution. But inside this room there is nothing but warmth and humanity. Welcome, Angie. 1987. And there is life again. All at once, he's at the end of the tunnel. He's turned the page. Light has come back when he no longer expected it. A little baby in the house, and everything is turned upside down. There are bottles everywhere, packages of diapers, baby formula. After 5 months, her first tooth. And 5 months later, her first steps on her own. Everything that is not her seems pathetic. October 19th, market crash. Black Monday. The Dow Jones down 20%. So? 1988. Angie's hungry. Angie wants a cookie. Angie's thirsty. Angie wants a Coca-Cola. It's already Christmas. The house is decorated, and a vigorous fire is crackling in the fireplace. Elliot has picked up the guitar again, and is picking out his own personal version of With or Without You. Tramp is watching over the family, and Angie is dancing in front of the flames. 1989. Angie is 3. She can write her name in block letters with a large felt pen. On March 24th, the tanker Exxon Valdez runs aground off the coast of Alaska. spilling 300,000 tons of crude oil and unleashing a black tide. CNN broadcasts an impassioned attack on Exxon by Greenpeace, delivered by its new spokesperson, Elena Cruz. In October, Rostropovich plays his cello in front of the Berlin Wall as it's demolished. On television, they explain it's the end of the Cold War, and from now on, people will live happily in a world full of democracy and the free market economy. 1990. The lines stretch out in front of the movie theater. In the first line are lots of families and noisy children. Elliot and Angie are waiting for The Little Mermaid, Walt Disney's latest, while people in the other line are waiting to see Meg Ryan in When Harry Met Sally. Angie is a little tired and yanks on her father's sleeve so he'll pick her up. "Get ready for takeoff," he yells as he grabs hold of her. As he picks up his daughter, he turns his head and catches sight of Matt and Tiffany waiting in the other line. An exchange of glances lasting half a second that seem to take place in slow motion. Elliot feels his heart go cold. The two men haven't spoken in almost 15 years. Tiffany looks at Angie with a sad smile and then turns away. Then the two pairs each go into a different theater. The time for explanations has not yet come. But one day, maybe.
End of CD 7.